The year is 1260. Across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, a shadow stretches longer than any empire before it. The Mongol Horde, unstoppable force of nature, conquerors of nations, destroyers of civilizations, stand at the gates of Bulgaria. They have crushed armies from China to Poland. They have turned cities into graveyards and kingdoms into dust. No force on earth has found a way to halt their advance. But here, on the banks of the Danube River, at a fortress called Vidin, something is about to change, something the Mongols never expected. A secret weapon, hidden in plain sight, will shatter their plans and send shockwaves through the greatest empire the world has ever known. This is the story of how a single battle changed everything. This is the Battle of Vidin. To understand what happened at Vidin, we must first understand the storm that was coming. The Mongol Empire in 1260 wasn't just an army. It was a force that had rewritten the rules of warfare, diplomacy, and survival itself. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had built an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the very doorstep of Western Europe. They had conquered the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire in a campaign of such brutality that entire regions never recovered, and humbled the proud warriors of Rusas in battles that left their princes dead and their cities burning. The Mongol way of war was unlike anything Europe had encountered. Their mounted archers could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Their composite bows, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, could pierce armor at distances that made European crossbows look like children's toys. They moved with a speed that defied belief, covering distances in days that would take conventional armies weeks. Their intelligence network was so sophisticated that they often knew more about their enemies than those enemies knew about themselves. They used psychological warfare as effectively as they used swords and arrows, spreading terror ahead of their armies so that cities would surrender without a fight. But perhaps most terrifying of all was their discipline. This wasn't a barbarian horde charging blindly into battle. The Mongols fought with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They used feigned retreats to draw enemies into traps. They coordinated attacks across hundreds of miles. They adapted to every terrain, every enemy, every challenge. When they faced the heavy cavalry of Europe, they learned to counter it. When they encountered fortified cities, they recruited Chinese engineers who taught them siege warfare. Nothing stopped them, nothing even slowed them down for long. By 1260, the western portion of the Mongol Empire was under the control of the Golden Horde, ruled by the descendants of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. These Mongols had established dominance over the Russian principalities, extracting tribute and crushing any hint of rebellion. Their eyes now turned southward, toward the fractured kingdoms of the Balkans. Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, all were potential targets. All seemed ripe for conquest. Bulgaria, in 1260, was a kingdom caught between worlds, once a mighty power that had challenged even Byzantium itself. Bulgaria now found itself weakened by decades of internal strife and external pressure. The Second Bulgarian Empire, as historians would later call it, had reached its zenith under Tsar Ivan Asen, the second earlier in the century. Under his rule, Bulgaria had controlled territories from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. But Ivan Asen died in 1241, and with his death, the cohesion of the empire began to unravel. By the time the Mongol threat loomed large, Bulgaria was ruled by Constantine Tik, a Tsar who had come to power through marriage rather than conquest. He had wed the daughter of the previous ruler, but his legitimacy was constantly questioned. The nobility was fractured. Regional governors exercised near-independent authority. The empire that had once stood united now existed as a patchwork of competing interests, held together by the thinnest of threads. Yet Bulgaria possessed something that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation: fortresses. Throughout their territory, the Bulgarians had constructed and maintained a network of formidable defensive positions. These weren't crude wooden palisades. They were stone fortifications built on strategic locations, often utilizing natural defenses like rivers and cliffs. Many of these fortresses dated back to Roman and Byzantine times, subsequently expanded and improved by successive Bulgarian rulers. Vidin was one such fortress. Located on the southern bank of the Danube River in northwestern Bulgaria, Vidin occupied a position of immense strategic importance. The Danube itself was one of Europe's greatest natural barriers, a wide, powerful river that marked the boundary between civilizations. Vidin sat at a bend in the river, giving its defenders excellent visibility both upstream and downstream. The fortress had been a military stronghold for centuries, first under the Romans, who called it Bononia, then under the Byzantines, and finally under the Bulgarians, who recognized its value as a guardian of the northwestern frontier. The fortress itself was impressive. Thick stone walls rose from the riverbank, reinforced with towers that allowed defenders to rain down projectiles on any attacker foolish enough to approach. Inside these walls was not just a military garrison, but a functioning town, capable of withstanding prolonged sieges. Wells provided water, granaries held food, armories stored weapons. The defenders of Vidin could hold out for months if necessary, but walls and supplies alone wouldn't stop the Mongols. The fortress cities of Rus had walls. The great fortifications of China had walls. The Mongols had taken them all. What Vidin needed, what Bulgaria needed, was something more. Something the Mongols hadn't encountered in quite this way before. The man who commanded Vidin's defense understood this reality with perfect clarity. His name, like so many details from this period, has been obscured by the mists of time and the scarcity of contemporary sources. Medieval Bulgarian chronicles are fragmentary, and many were lost during subsequent Ottoman rule. What we do know is that the commander was a veteran of Bulgaria's long wars, a man who had likely fought against Byzantines, Hungarians, and possibly even earlier Mongol raids. He was not a young idealist, but a pragmatic warrior who understood that courage alone wouldn't save his city. In the months before the Mongol advance, as refugees from the north brought increasingly terrifying reports of the approaching horde, this commander made his preparations. He stockpiled not just food and arrows, but something else. Something that would prove to be the decisive factor in the battle to come. The Mongols arrived in the winter of 1260. Their approach was heralded by the silence that preceded them, the eerie quiet that fell over the countryside as people fled or hid. Then came the scouts, Mongol riders moving with that characteristic fluid grace, surveying the land, noting every path, every ford, every potential weakness. Behind them came the main force, thousands upon thousands of horsemen moving across the frozen landscape like a dark tide. The Mongol commander, whose identity is also lost to history, but who likely held the rank of a two-man commander, meaning he led 10,000 men, surveyed Vidin from across the Danube. He had conquered fortresses before. The procedure was well established. First, cut off all supply lines, surround the position completely so no reinforcements can arrive and no defenders can escape. Then offer terms, surrender and live as subjects of the Khan, or resist and face total annihilation. Most chose surrender. Those who chose resistance usually regretted it, though not for long. But Vidin presented unique challenges. The Danube, even in winter, was a formidable obstacle. The Mongols were brilliant horsemen on open plains, but river crossings were always dangerous, especially against a defended position. The commander knew his men could cross the river, but they would be vulnerable during the crossing, exposed to whatever the defenders could throw at them. Still, it had to be done. The Khan's orders were clear. Bulgaria must submit. Vidin was the key to northwestern Bulgaria. Take Vidin, and the rest would follow. The Mongol commander deployed his forces along the northern bank of the Danube. Thousands of warriors, their breath visible in the cold air, prepared for the assault. Engineers were brought forward to construct the equipment needed for a crossing and subsequent siege. Trees were felled, Rafts were built. Siege engines began to take shape. Inside Vidin, the defenders watched and prepared. They could see the Mongol camp spreading like a dark stain across the opposite shore. They could count the enemy forces, and what they counted brought no comfort. The Mongols outnumbered them significantly, but numbers weren't everything. The defenders' advantage was real, and they had something else. Something the Mongol commander didn't yet know about. The initial Mongol assault came on a gray winter morning, when ice still clung to the reeds along the riverbank. The Mongols began their crossing in multiple locations simultaneously, a classic tactic designed to divide the defenders' attention and resources. Rafts pushed out into the current, laden with warriors. Some Mongols even attempted to ford the river on horseback at shallower points, though the cold water made this treacherous. The defenders of Vidin responded immediately. Arrows began to fly from the fortress walls and from positions along the riverbank. The Mongols, used to being the ones who dominated through archery, now found themselves on the receiving end of a withering barrage. Men tumbled from rafts into the icy water. Horses screamed and thrashed as arrows found their marks. The crossing, which should have been difficult but achievable, was becoming a bloodbath. But this was still conventional warfare, the kind of back and forth the Mongols had encountered countless times before. Their archers began to return fire, trying to suppress the defenders. Some of their rafts made it across. Warriors established small footholds on the southern bank. The battle was fierce, but this was what the Mongols did. This was what they excelled at. Press the advantage, overwhelm the enemy, break their will. Then the defenders unveiled their secret weapon, Greek fire. The very words conjured terror throughout the medieval world. This incendiary substance, whose exact composition remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Byzantine Empire, was a weapon of nightmares. It was a liquid that burned with intense heat, and most terrifying of all, could not be extinguished by water. In fact, water often made it worse, spreading the flames rather than dousing them. Greek fire had saved Constantinople from Arab sieges. It had destroyed entire fleets. It was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of a nuclear weapon, a trump card that changed the equation of any battle in which it appeared. The exact formula for Greek fire was known only to a select few, passed down through generations of Byzantine imperial pyrotechnicians. The base likely included petroleum products, possibly naphtha or crude oil, which were available in certain regions around the Black Sea. To this were added other substances, sulfur, which increased the intensity and made the flames even more difficult to extinguish, quicklime, which reacted violently with water, creating heat and helping to spread the fire, and possibly pine resin or other sticky substances to help it adhere to whatever it touched. The mixture was then heated and pressurized, allowing it to be sprayed through specially designed siphons, essentially ancient flamethrowers. How did Bulgaria, a kingdom that was not Byzantium, come to possess this weapon? The answer lies in the complex web of medieval politics and the permeability of closely guarded secrets. Throughout the 13th century, Bulgaria and Byzantium had been sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always neighbors who interacted extensively. Byzantine refugees fleeing political turmoil often found sanctuary in Bulgarian cities. Greek merchants traded throughout Bulgarian territories. Byzantine engineers and craftsmen might be employed by Bulgarian rulers. It's likely that at some point, whether through espionage, defection, or as part of a military alliance, the secret of Greek fire, or at least a workable approximation of it, made its way to Bulgaria. The Bulgarians, facing the same threats from steppe nomads that Byzantium had faced for centuries, would have recognized its immense value. They may not have possessed the full Byzantine formula, but they had something close enough to make a decisive difference. The defenders of Vidin had prepared their Greek fire in the months before the Mongol arrival. Clay pots filled with the volatile mixture, handheld siphons for close-range use, larger, more elaborate devices mounted on the walls capable of projecting streams of liquid fire. They had practiced in secret, understanding that surprise would multiply the weapon's effectiveness. Now, as the Mongols pressed their assault across the Danube, the moment had come to unleash it. Imagine, if you will, the perspective of a Mongol warrior that day. You are among the greatest soldiers in the world, part of an army that has never been defeated, an empire that stretches farther than any in history. You have crossed deserts and mountains. You have stormed cities and broken kingdoms. This fortress on the river is just another obstacle to overcome. Yes, the crossing is proving more difficult than expected. Yes, more men are falling than anticipated. But this is still just a battle, and battles can be won through courage, skill, and numbers. You are on a raft, pushing through the cold water of the Danube. Your companions row with determination. Arrows hiss overhead, some finding marks, others splashing into the water. The southern bank grows closer. You can see the enemy now, Bulgarian warriors lined up to meet you. You grip your bow tighter, ready to return fire once you're on solid ground. This is what you train for. This is what you do. Then you see something arc through the air from the fortress walls. At first, it looks like an ordinary projectile, perhaps a pot of pitch or tar, something meant to rain down burning oil. Your army has faced such things before. Unpleasant, yes, but not decisive. The pot shatters against a raft near yours. For a split second, nothing happens. Then the world turns to fire. Flames erupt across the surface of the water itself, spreading impossibly fast. The burning liquid clings to everything it touches: men, wood, leather. Even the water seems to be on fire. Warriors scream, not the controlled battle cries of soldiers, but the primal shrieks of men being burned alive. They throw themselves into the river to extinguish the flames, but the water doesn't help. If anything, it makes it worse. The fire follows them beneath the surface. Men who submerge themselves come up still burning. The smell of burning flesh fills the air. The screams pierce through all other sounds of battle. More pots of Greek fire rain down from the fortress. The defenders have brought their supplies to bear with devastating effectiveness. They target the rafts, the crossing points, anywhere Mongols are clustered. Each impact creates a new inferno. The river itself becomes a barrier of flame. Rafts disintegrate into floating pyres. Warriors who moments ago were confident in victory now think only of survival, of getting away from this hellish substance that defies all natural laws. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction. The Mongols built their reputation on being the most fearsome force in the world. They were the ones who created terror. They were the unstoppable tide. But now they face something they couldn't overcome through skill or courage. You can't outride fire that sticks to you. You can't shoot an arrow at flames that burn on water. The very foundations of their tactical superiority meant nothing against an enemy who could turn the battlefield itself into an inferno. The Mongol commander, watching from the northern bank, understood immediately that the assault was failing. This wasn't merely difficult, it was impossible. His warriors, the finest in the world, were being immolated. Those who made it to the southern bank were in no condition to fight, and the defenders were taking full advantage, cutting down the burned and disoriented survivors. The crossing points had become killing zones. To continue the assault would be to send men to certain death with no prospect of success. Military commanders are taught to recognize when a position is unassailable, when the cost of victory exceeds any possible gain. The Mongol general had not risen to his position by being foolhardy. He made the decision that no Mongol commander ever wanted to make: retreat. The signal was given. Warriors still on the northern bank stood down. Those trapped on the southern bank or in the river were left to their own desperate attempts at survival. The assault on Vidin was over. But the Mongols didn't simply pack up and go home. That wasn't their way. They remained encamped on the northern bank for several more days, assessing the situation, looking for alternatives. Could they bypass Vidin, leave it isolated, and cut off while they advanced deeper into Bulgaria? That was possible, but it meant leaving a hostile fortress on their supply lines, a garrison that could raid their rear, or provide a rallying point for Bulgarian resistance? Could they starve the fortress out, maintain a siege until the defenders ran out of food and that terrible fire weapon? Perhaps, but a siege of a well-supplied fortress could take months, even years, and winter was deepening. The Danube might freeze solid, eliminating the river's defensive advantage, but also making the region even harder to operate in. Moreover, word of what happened at Vidin would spread. The Bulgarian kingdoms, fragmented though they were, would learn that the Mongols could be stopped. Resistance would stiffen. Other fortresses would prepare similar defenses. The psychological advantage that the Mongols relied upon, the terror that made armies flee and cities surrender, would be diminished. There was also the broader strategic situation to consider. The Mongol Empire in 1260 was not the unified colossus it had been under Genghis Khan. It was beginning to fracture. In the east, Kublai Khan was consolidating his power in China, eventually establishing the Yuan dynasty. In Persia, the Ilkhanate was emerging as a distinct entity. And here in the west, the Golden Horde was increasingly focused on its own regional interests rather than grand campaigns of unlimited conquest. The Khan who ruled the Golden Horde had to balance ambition against practicality. A costly campaign in Bulgaria that might take years to complete was less attractive than consolidating control over the vast territories already under Mongol dominion. Within a week of the failed assault, the Mongol army began to withdraw. They didn't flee in panic. This was an orderly withdrawal, the kind of professional retrograde movement that only a disciplined army could execute. But it was still a withdrawal. The Mongols were leaving. Vidin had held. Bulgaria had survived. Inside the fortress, as the defenders watched the Mongol camp slowly dismantle, and the great army begin its march northward, the relief must have been overwhelming. They had faced the unstoppable force and stopped it. The warriors who had seemed invincible had been driven back. The empire that had conquered half the world had turned away from their walls. It seemed almost impossible, and yet it had happened. The commander of Vidin, that unnamed hero, whose identity has been lost, but whose achievement remains, must have understood the magnitude of what had occurred. This wasn't just a tactical victory. This was a strategic turning point. The Mongol advance into southeastern Europe had been halted, not through some massive coalition of kingdoms, not through a climactic field battle where tens of thousands clashed, but through the determined defense of a single fortress armed with a weapon the Mongols couldn't counter. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout the region. Bulgarian chronicles, fragmentary though they are, record the event as a moment of salvation. The Mongol threat, which had loomed so large, was pushed back. Constantine Tikh's legitimacy as ruler was bolstered, at least temporarily, by his kingdom's successful resistance. The nobility who had been fractious found a moment of unity in shared survival. But the significance of Vidin extended beyond Bulgaria's borders. Hungary, which had been devastated by earlier Mongol invasions in 1241, breathed easier, knowing that the hordes wouldn't be returning through the Bulgarian gateway. Serbia and the fragmented Byzantine successor states took note. The Mongols could be stopped. Fortifications mattered. New weapons and tactics could level the playing field. The Battle of Vidin also marked a subtle but important shift in medieval European warfare. Up to this point, the heavy cavalry charge had been the dominant paradigm of European military thinking. Knights in armor, fighting from horseback, were considered the ultimate military force. The Mongol invasions had brutally demonstrated the limitations of this approach. Mongol mobility and archery had consistently defeated European heavy cavalry. But Greek fire showed that technological innovation, particularly in the realm of weapons and defensive engineering, could counter even the most effective military system. This helped spark a broader European interest in developing new military technologies, a trend that would eventually lead to the introduction of gunpowder weapons in the following centuries. From the Mongol perspective, Vidin represented something more troubling than a single tactical defeat. It exposed a vulnerability in their system. The Mongols excelled at open field warfare and at adapting to new challenges, but Greek fire was something different. It was a weapon they couldn't capture and turn against their enemies, as they had done with siege engines and other military technology. It was a weapon that negated many of their advantages. They couldn't outmaneuver fire that burned on water. They couldn't use their superior archery to suppress defenders who could turn the battlefield into an inferno. The Golden Horde's leadership, receiving reports of the failed assault, had to reassess their strategic priorities. The costs of conquering southeastern Europe suddenly seemed much higher. The potential rewards, while real, might not justify a protracted campaign against an enemy who possessed such weapons. There were other regions to dominate, other tribute to collect. The decision was made likely not in any single dramatic moment but through a series of strategic recalculations to focus the Golden Horde's energies elsewhere. Bulgaria would be left to its own devices, at least for the time being. This isn't to say the Mongols gave up entirely on the region. They continued to exert influence through diplomacy, threats, and occasional raids, but the era of massive invasions seeking to incorporate Bulgaria fully into the Mongol Empire was effectively over. Vidin had closed that door. The defenders of Vidin had used Greek fire with devastating effectiveness, but the weapon itself deserves deeper examination. Greek fire was not just militarily significant, it was technologically remarkable for its era. The medieval world did not understand chemistry as we do today. They didn't have theories about molecules or oxidation reactions. Yet through experimentation and inherited knowledge, Byzantine craftsmen had developed a substance that behaved in ways that seemed almost magical to contemporaries. The mechanisms of this diffusion were varied. Sometimes it was espionage, with agents sent specifically to steal secrets. Sometimes it was defection, with craftsmen or engineers taking their knowledge to new employers. Sometimes it was capture, with weapons or equipment being seized in battle and then reverse engineered. And sometimes it was simply commerce and cultural exchange, with knowledge passing through the countless interactions between different societies. In Bulgaria's case, the proximity to Byzantium and the centuries of interaction between the two powers made the transfer of Greek fire technology almost inevitable. Byzantine emperors might issue death penalties for revealing the secret, but they couldn't control every engineer, every soldier, every merchant who had seen the weapon in action or heard rumors of its composition. Over time, enough information leaked that other powers could develop their own versions, even if they lacked the exact Byzantine formula. This pattern of technological diffusion meant that no military advantage, no matter how decisive, was permanent. The Mongols themselves understood this well. They had built their empire partly by adopting and adapting technologies from conquered peoples. Chinese siege engines, Persian administrative systems, Islamic scientific knowledge, all were integrated into the Mongol military and governmental apparatus. But what could be adopted could also be turned against them. Just as they used Chinese engineering to conquer Chinese cities, their enemies could use Byzantine chemistry to defend against Mongol attacks. The human cost of Vidin, like so many medieval battles, is difficult to quantify precisely. Chronicles from the period rarely provide accurate casualty figures, and even when they do provide numbers, those numbers are often exaggerated or purely symbolic. What we can say with confidence is that the Mongol losses during the assault were significant enough to convince their commander to withdraw. Given the typical Mongol willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, this suggests losses that were not merely substantial, but approaching catastrophic levels. For individual Mongol warriors who survived the assault, the experience must have been traumatic. These were men who had built their identities around being the world's foremost soldiers, part of an army that had conquered everything it encountered. To be defeated, and not in fair combat where skill and courage could make a difference, but by a weapon that turned the battlefield into hell itself, would have shaken that identity to its core. Survivors would have carried physical scars from burns, but also psychological scars from having faced something that defied their understanding of warfare. On the Bulgarian side, the defenders of Vidin experienced the unique euphoria that comes from surviving against impossible odds. They had stared into the abyss and not blinked. Every man who stood on those walls during the assault knew they were facing the Mongols, knew the reputation of the enemy, knew what happened to those who resisted. Yet they had fought anyway, and they had won. That kind of experience creates bonds between soldiers that last lifetimes. Veterans of Vidin would have told their stories for decades afterward, passing them on to children and grandchildren. But victory also came with costs for the defenders. Greek fire was indiscriminate in its destruction. Some Bulgarian warriors must have been caught by their own weapon, victims of misdirected shots or premature ignitions, or the unpredictable nature of liquid fire. The psychological toll of using such a weapon shouldn't be underestimated either. There's a reason that even in modern warfare, flamethrowers and incendiary weapons are regarded with particular horror. Burning enemies alive, hearing their screams, smelling their flesh cook, these experiences leave marks on those who inflict them as surely as on those who suffer them. The fortress of Vidin itself survived the battle, but, like many medieval fortifications, did not survive the centuries intact. Over the following decades and centuries, it was repeatedly modified, damaged in subsequent conflicts, rebuilt, and eventually largely dismantled or incorporated into later constructions. Today, visitors to the modern Bulgarian city of Vidin can see remnants of the medieval fortifications, including impressive stone walls and towers. But much of what the 1,260 defenders knew is gone, replaced by Ottoman-era constructions and modern development. Archaeological work at Vidin has provided some insights into the medieval fortress, revealing the extent of the fortifications and the sophistication of the defensive works. Excavations have uncovered evidence of habitation spanning from Roman times through the medieval period and beyond. While physical evidence specifically linked to the 1260 battle is scarce, the overall picture that emerges is of a substantial, well-fortified position that could indeed have withstood the kind of assault described in the chronicles. The broader historical trajectory of the Mongol Empire provides important context for understanding Vidin's significance. By 1260, the empire was already beginning its long fragmentation. Mongol Khan had died in 1259, precipitating a succession crisis. Kublai Khan and Arik Boke were engaged in a civil war for supremacy that would last until 1264. This internal conflict diverted attention and resources away from external conquest. The various Khanates, the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and Kublai's domains in China and Mongolia, were increasingly operating as independent entities with their own priorities. In this context, the Golden Horde's decision to withdraw from Bulgaria, rather than commit to a prolonged campaign, makes even more sense. The Khan needed his warriors and resources available for potential conflicts with rival Mongol factions, as much as for external conquests. A costly siege of Vidin, even if ultimately successful, would have weakened the Golden Horde at a moment when internal Mongol politics were unstable and dangerous. The weapons and tactics used at Vidin also reflect the medieval arms race that characterized warfare in this period. Just as castles and fortifications grew more sophisticated in response to improvements in siege warfare, so too did weapons evolve in response to new defensive technologies. Greek fire represented one pole of this competition, a weapon so effective that it forced attackers to fundamentally reconsider their approach. But attackers would eventually develop countermeasures or alternative strategies. In the specific case of Greek fire, its effectiveness began to decline as its secret spread more widely and as potential targets learned how to defend against it. Armies facing enemies equipped with Greek fire would attempt river crossings at night or in fog when the weapon's deployment would be more difficult. They would construct fire-resistant shields or use wetted leather to provide some protection. they would disperse their forces to avoid presenting concentrated targets. And eventually, as gunpowder weapons became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, Greek fire's unique advantages diminished. Why go to the trouble of producing complex incendiary mixtures when you could simply blow holes in fortress walls with cannons? The story of Vidin also reminds us of the importance of leadership in military history. The unnamed commander who prepared the defense, who obtained or produced the Greek fire, who trained his men in its use, who maintained discipline during the terrifying assault. This man, whose name has been lost to time, shaped the outcome of the battle as surely as any weapon or fortification. Good leadership multiplies the effectiveness of forces and resources. Poor leadership squanders even the greatest advantages. This principle was understood in the medieval world, though perhaps not articulated in quite the same terms modern military theorists might use. Chronicles and epic poems of the era constantly emphasize the qualities of leaders, their courage, wisdom, decisiveness. The cult of the heroic commander, whether Alexander, Caesar, or Charlemagne, was central to medieval military culture. A great leader could inspire men to hold against impossible odds, could devise strategies that overcame material disadvantages, could maintain cohesion when all seemed lost. The Mongol commander facing Vidin was likely competent, possibly excellent at his craft. He had risen through the ranks of the most effective military organization in the world, but he faced an impossible situation. A fortress he couldn't take without catastrophic losses, a weapon he couldn't counter with conventional tactics. His decision to withdraw, rather than persisting in a futile assault out of pride or stubbornness, was itself a form of leadership. He preserved his forces for another day, another battle where the odds might be more favorable. The religious dimensions of the Battle of Vidin, while not as prominent in the sources as they might be for some medieval conflicts, were nonetheless present. Bulgaria was an Orthodox Christian kingdom, and the Mongols, though religiously tolerant compared to many medieval powers, were seen as pagan invaders threatening Christian lands. The defense of Vidin would have been framed, at least in part, as the defense of Christendom itself. Bulgarian clergy would have prayed for deliverance from the Mongol threat. Church bells would have rung in celebration when the Mongols withdrew. The victory might have been attributed to divine intervention, with God favoring the righteous defenders over the pagan invaders. This religious interpretation, while perhaps not strictly accurate from a military history perspective, was real and meaningful to the people of the time. It shaped how they understood events, how they processed trauma, and how they constructed meaning from their experiences. The Mongols, for their part, practiced a form of shamanic religion that coexisted with pragmatic tolerance for the various faiths found throughout their empire. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, all were allowed to practice freely as long as they didn't challenge Mongol authority. This tolerance was itself a tool of empire, reducing religious conflict within Mongol territories and making subject populations easier to govern. But it also meant that the Mongols didn't frame their campaigns in religious terms the way Christian crusaders or Muslim warriors often did. For the Mongols, conquest was about power, tribute, and the expansion of the Khan's domain, not about spreading or defending a particular faith. The economic consequences of Vidin extended beyond the immediate military outcome. Successful defense of the fortress meant that trade routes through Bulgaria remained open. Merchants could continue moving goods between the Black Sea coast and inland Europe without facing Mongol disruption. Cities could maintain their commercial activities without the devastating interruption of invasion. The Bulgarian economy, while never robust during this period, avoided the complete collapse that Mongol conquest typically brought. This economic continuity mattered more than might be immediately apparent. Medieval economies were fragile, dependent on relatively small-scale trade networks and agricultural production. Even a brief disruption could cause cascading failures. Fields left unharvested because farmers had fled or been killed, trade goods abandoned or destroyed, workshops and mills burned. Recovery from such disruptions could take generations. By avoiding this fate, Bulgaria maintained its economic foundations, however weak they might have been compared to wealthier regions of Europe. The lessons of Vidin were not lost on other European powers. Word of the battle spread through the networks of communication that connected medieval kingdoms, diplomatic correspondence, merchant reports, traveling scholars, and clerics. The message was clear. Fortifications combined with advanced weapons could stop the Mongols. This encouraged continued investment in castle building and military technology throughout Eastern Europe. While the Mongol threat gradually receded anyway due to internal empire politics, the perception that defense was possible surely influenced how European rulers approached their military planning. Hungarian kings, in particular, took note. Hungary had been devastated by the Mongol invasion of 1241 and lived in constant fear of their return. After Vidin, Hungarian investment in fortifications intensified. Stone castles replaced wooden ones. Strategic positions were fortified. Garrison forces were maintained and trained. While the expected Mongol return never fully materialized, these preparations weren't wasted. The fortifications and military infrastructure would prove valuable in later conflicts with Ottoman Turkey and in Hungary's complex internal politics. The cultural memory of Vidin in Bulgaria itself is fascinating to trace. Medieval Bulgarian literature and chronicle traditions, while fragmentary, preserve references to the battle. It becomes part of the national story, a moment of triumph in a period otherwise characterized by decline and fragmentation. Later Bulgarian historians, writing under Ottoman rule, or in the modern era, would often highlight Vidin as an example of Bulgarian martial prowess and resilience. However, this cultural memory also illustrates how history gets simplified and mythologized over time. The complex reality of the battle, the role of Greek fire, the specific strategic circumstances, all tend to fade from popular memory. What remains is a simplified narrative. Brave Bulgarians defeated the mighty Mongols at Vidin. This isn't necessarily wrong, but it's incomplete. The full story, with all its contingencies and complexities, is richer and in many ways more interesting than the simplified myth. The technology of Greek fire itself continued to evolve and be used in various forms for centuries after Vidin. Byzantine forces continued deploying it in naval battles well into the medieval period. Arab and other Middle Eastern powers developed their own incendiary weapons, sometimes based on Greek fire principles, sometimes using different formulas. The knowledge gradually spread, even as the original Byzantine formula remained secret or was eventually lost entirely. By the Renaissance period, incendiary weapons were relatively common in European warfare, though they were gradually being superseded by gunpowder-based weapons. The early modern period saw various experiments with fire weapons. Fire ships used in naval warfare, incendiary projectiles hurled by trebuchets and later by cannons, even attempts to create handheld fire-projecting devices. The basic concept of Greek fire, liquid fire that sticks to targets and burns intensely, would eventually resurface in modern warfare in the form of napalm and other incendiary weapons. The ethical questions surrounding weapons like Greek fire deserve consideration. Even in the medieval period, there were debates about what methods of warfare were acceptable. The Church attempted to regulate warfare through concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God, limiting who could be fought and when. Certain weapons, like crossbows, were at various times condemned as unchivalrous or excessively cruel. Greek fire, with its capacity to cause horrific burns and its terror-inducing properties, existed in a morally ambiguous space. For the defenders of Vidin, these ethical considerations likely seemed less important than survival. When facing an enemy who had demonstrated willingness to massacre entire populations, using the most effective defensive weapon available was not just justified, but necessary. War has always involved this tension between ethical ideals and practical necessities. Greek fire represented a weapon that was unquestionably horrible in its effects, but also undeniably effective in its purpose. The command structure and organization of the defense at Vidin likely followed typical medieval military patterns. The overall commander, probably a nobleman appointed by the Bulgarian Tsar, would have directed strategy and made key decisions. Under him would have been subordinate officers, each responsible for sections of the defense or specific units. The garrison itself would have included professional soldiers, possibly some mounted knights or heavy cavalry, archers, and various support personnel. The town's militia, men obligated to fight in defense of their home, would have supplemented the professional garrison. The use of Greek fire would have required specialized personnel. Operating the siphons and projection devices wasn't something any random soldier could do. It required training, practice, and a certain degree of courage given the weapon's dangerous nature. There must have been a group of men, perhaps a dozen or more, who were specifically trained in Greek fire deployment. These specialists would have been crucial to the battle's outcome, and their expertise represented an investment of time and resources that paid enormous dividends when the Mongols attacked. The logistics of the defense also deserve attention. A fortress under siege or threat of siege needs stockpiles of everything: food, water, arrows, weapons, medical supplies, and in this case, the components for Greek fire. Acquiring these supplies, particularly the specialized materials for Greek fire, would have required advanced planning and significant expense. Someone, whether the fortress commander or Bulgarian royal officials, had to authorize these expenditures, procure the materials, and ensure they were properly stored and maintained. This logistical preparation is often overlooked in military history, but it's frequently the difference between success and failure. A fortress with strong walls but empty granaries will fall to starvation. An army with excellent soldiers but inadequate supply lines will collapse. Vidin's successful defense rested not just on the moment of battle, but on months or years of careful preparation before the Mongols ever appeared. The immediate aftermath of the Mongol withdrawal. This uncertainty was perhaps the hardest burden to bear. The Mongols had withdrawn, yes, but they hadn't been destroyed. Their empire still existed, vast and powerful. What if they returned with larger forces, with countermeasures to Greek fire, with renewed determination? The defenders couldn't know that the strategic situation had shifted, that the Mongols wouldn't be launching major campaigns into Bulgaria again. They had to live with the possibility that the reprieve was temporary. In the event the reprieve proved lasting, the Mongols never mounted another serious attempt to conquer Bulgaria. The Golden Horde focused on maintaining and exploiting its existing domains. Bulgaria's independence, such as it was, continued for over another century until the Ottoman conquest. But the people of 1260 couldn't know this future. They lived with the trauma and uncertainty that major warfare always creates, the knowledge that the world is dangerous and that survival is never guaranteed. The broader historical narrative of the 13th century is dominated by the Mongol conquests, and rightly so. No other single factor shaped Eurasia more dramatically during this period. But focusing exclusively on Mongol success can obscure the many instances of successful resistance. Vidin was one such instance. The Mamluks of Egypt dealt the Mongols a major defeat at Ain Jalut, also in 1260, halting their advance through the Middle East. Japanese defenders, aided by typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze or divine wind, repelled Mongol invasion attempts in the 1270s and 1280s. Various Southeast Asian kingdoms successfully resisted or limited Mongol incursions. These defensive successes share certain common features. Almost all involved either exceptional natural barriers that negated Mongol mobility advantages or technological and tactical innovations that the Mongols were unprepared for, or both. Vidin had the Danube River as a natural barrier and Greek fire as the technological surprise. Anjalut saw Mamluk heavy cavalry using tactics specifically designed to counter Mongol mobility. The Japanese invasions failed partly due to the Mongols' lack of naval expertise and partly due to the storms that destroyed their fleet. In each case, the defenders found ways to neutralize or minimize the usual Mongol advantages. This pattern suggests an important historical principle. No military system, however effective, is invincible. Every approach to warfare has inherent vulnerabilities. Success breeds a kind of tactical conservatism, where armies continue doing what has worked in the past. But opponents study these patterns and develop countermeasures. The more successful a military system is, the more attention it attracts from potential enemies seeking ways to defeat it. The Mongols' very success ensured that everyone they threatened was desperately searching for ways to stop them. Eventually, some of those attempts succeeded. The long-term decline of Mongol power wasn't primarily due to military defeats like Vidin or Anjalut, though these certainly mattered. More important were internal factors: the fragmentation of the empire into rival khanates, the gradual adoption of sedentary lifestyles that eroded the nomadic military culture that had made the Mongols so formidable, and the simple fact that once conquest stopped providing new resources, the economic model of the empire became unsustainable. But the defensive successes of the 1260s marked the moment when Mongol expansion definitively ended, when the tide of conquest receded and left behind a changed but not destroyed landscape. For Bulgaria specifically, the century following Vidin was a period of continued decline despite the victory. The underlying weaknesses of the kingdom, the political fragmentation, the economic challenges, the pressure from multiple hostile neighbors, these problems didn't disappear just because the Mongols had been repelled. Constantine Tikh's successors struggled to maintain authority. Regional magnates became increasingly autonomous. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which had been a unifying institution, found its influence diminished by political chaos. By the mid-14th century, Bulgaria had effectively split into multiple principalities. The Second Bulgarian Empire had fragmented into the northern state around Vidin itself. Ironically, the eastern state centered on the capital Tarnovo and various other smaller territories. This fragmentation made Bulgaria easy prey when the Ottoman Turks began their expansion into the Balkans. Between 1362 and 1396, the various Bulgarian principalities were conquered one by the Ottomans. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where a crusader army attempting to relieve Bulgaria was defeated by the Ottomans, marked the final end of Bulgarian independence. It would not be restored until 1878. Yet even under Ottoman rule, the memory of Bulgaria's medieval kingdom persisted. The Orthodox Church maintained Bulgarian identity through centuries of foreign domination. Chronicles and traditions were preserved in monasteries. When Bulgarian nationalism emerged in the 19th century, historians and writers look back to the medieval period for inspiration and examples of Bulgarian glory. Vidin, as a victory against enormous odds, naturally featured in these nationalist narratives. The fortress of Vidin itself remained strategically important under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans rebuilt and expanded the fortifications, recognizing the site's value. During the Russo-Turkish Wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, Vidin was repeatedly besieged and contested. In 1773, it was the center of an autonomous principality under Osman Pasvantoglu that defied Ottoman central authority. Even in World War II, the region saw military activity. The site that had witnessed the repulse of the Mongols in 1260 continued to play roles in military conflicts for centuries. Today, modern Vidin is a modest Bulgarian city on the Danube, better known for its economic struggles and demographic decline than for its historical significance. The medieval fortress, partially preserved and partially incorporated into later constructions, is a tourist attraction, but not a major one. Visitors can walk the walls and imagine the medieval city, but the connection to the dramatic events of 1260 requires historical knowledge and imagination that most casual visitors lack. This disconnection between past significance and present obscurity is common in history. Places where world-changing events occurred often become ordinary over time. The sites of great battles become farmers' fields or suburban developments. Fortresses that withstood sieges crumble or get repurposed. The physical landscape remains, but the meaning, the intensity, the life and death stakes that once defined these places fade into historical abstraction. Yet the Battle of Vidin deserves to be remembered and understood, not just as an interesting footnote in medieval history, but as a significant event that shaped the trajectory of Eastern Europe. It demonstrated that the Mongols could be stopped through proper preparation and innovative tactics. It preserved Bulgarian independence for over a century. It marked the effective end of Mongol expansion into southeastern Europe, and it showcased the decisive power of technological innovation in warfare, a theme that would only become more important in subsequent centuries. The lessons of Vidin remain relevant even in the modern era. The importance of preparation and foresight, the value of adapting new technologies before your enemies do, the reality that no matter how powerful an adversary seems, there are always potential vulnerabilities to exploit. The fact that defense is possible even when the odds seem impossible. These principles, demonstrated on the banks of the Danube in 1260, continue to resonate in military thinking today. As we reflect on the Battle of Vidin, we should remember the human beings at its center. The Bulgarian defenders who stood on those walls, knowing they faced the most feared army in the world. The Mongol warriors who attacked with courage and discipline, only to encounter a weapon they had no defense against. The commander who made the agonizing decision to continue the attack despite mounting casualties, and then the even harder decision to withdraw. The townspeople sheltering within the fortress walls, listening to the sounds of battle and wondering if they would survive to see another day. The wounded and dying on both sides, experiencing the universal agony that war inflicts regardless of nationality or cause. These people lived in a world very different from ours. Their technologies, their societies, their worldviews, all were products of the medieval period, but their fundamental humanity, their capacity for courage and fear, hope and despair, triumph and tragedy, this they shared with people of all eras. When we study historical events like the Battle of Vidin, we're not just learning about the past, we're connecting with the human experience across time, understanding that the same forces that shaped their lives continue to shape ours. The story of Vidin is ultimately a story about the unexpected, about how history doesn't always flow in the direction that seems inevitable. In 1260, the Mongol conquest of Bulgaria seemed almost certain. They were the unstoppable force. They had conquered everything in their path. But history is made up of countless individual decisions and actions, and sometimes those decisions and actions combine in ways that change everything. A Bulgarian commander decides to acquire Greek fire. Engineers design effective deployment systems. Defenders train in its use. And when the moment comes, when the Mongols attack across the Danube, these preparations pay off in a way that halts an empire. We live in an age that sometimes feels predetermined, where powerful forces seem to make individual actions irrelevant. The Battle of Vidin reminds us that this feeling is an illusion. Preparation matters. Innovation matters. The courage to stand and fight when everything seems lost, this matters enormously. The defenders of Vidin, whose names are mostly forgotten, changed the course of European history. They proved that even the mightiest empire could be checked, that walls and weapons and will could prevail against overwhelming odds. As the sun set on that winter day in 1260, as the Mongol army began its withdrawal, and the defenders of Vidin watched them go, No one could have fully understood the significance of what had just occurred. They knew they had survived. They knew they had won. But they couldn't know that they had just witnessed the high water mark of Mongol expansion in southeastern Europe, that future generations would look back on this battle as a turning point, that historians centuries later would study and analyze what happened on those riverbanks. History is like that. The people living through events rarely recognize their full significance. They're too focused on immediate concerns, on survival and security, on what comes next. It's only with the perspective of time that we can see how individual events fit into larger patterns, how single battles can shift the trajectory of entire civilizations. The Battle of Vidin, small in scale compared to some of the great clashes of medieval history, proved to be large in consequence. It stands as a testament to the power of defensive preparation, technological innovation, and human determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The broader context of 13th century warfare helps us appreciate what made Vidin so significant. This was an era when military power seemed concentrated in the hands of mobile, cavalry-based armies. The Mongols had perfected this form of warfare to a degree never before seen. Their ability to move vast armies across enormous distances, their mastery of the composite bow, their tactical flexibility, all combined to make them seemingly invincible in open battle. European heavy cavalry, which had dominated Western warfare for centuries, proved largely ineffective against Mongol tactics. The mounted knights, who were the pride of European nobility, found themselves outmaneuvered and outshot by Mongol horse archers. In this military environment, static defenses were often seen as inadequate. Yes, castles and fortified cities could slow an advance, but the Mongols had demonstrated time and again that they could adapt. They recruited siege engineers, learned to use trebuchets and other siege equipment, and proved willing to invest the time necessary to reduce fortifications. The fall of so many Russian and Chinese cities to Mongol sieges suggested that fortifications alone were not enough. What changed the equation at Vidin was the combination of strong fortifications, a significant natural barrier in the Danube, and a technological trump card in Greek fire. Each element alone might have been insufficient. The Danube could be crossed, given time and determination. Fortifications could be besieged. But Greek fire, deployed effectively from a strong defensive position with a river barrier in front, created a situation where the usual Mongol advantages were nullified. Looking at the broader 13th century context, Vidin was one of several points where Mongol expansion was checked or halted. In the east, the Mongols eventually conquered most of China, but the southern Song dynasty resisted for decades, not falling completely until 1279. In the Middle East, the Battle of Anjalut in 1260 stopped Mongol expansion into Egypt and the Levant. In Japan, the failed invasion attempts of 1274 and 1281 demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible at sea. In Southeast Asia, various kingdoms managed to resist or limit Mongol incursions through a combination of guerrilla warfare, difficult terrain, and occasionally outright military victories. What these various resistance efforts had in common was that they all exploited specific weaknesses in the Mongol military system. The Mongols were supreme on open plains, where their mobility and archery could be fully utilized. They were adaptable and could learn siege warfare, naval operations, and fighting in various terrains. But there were limits to their advantages. Strong fortifications combined with effective defensive weapons could stop them, as Vidin demonstrated. Difficult terrain that negated cavalry mobility could stymie them, as various Southeast Asian campaigns showed. Naval warfare was never their strength, as the Japanese invasions proved. The lesson here is that no military system is perfect. Every approach to warfare has inherent trade-offs. The Mongol focus on mobile cavalry warfare gave them enormous advantages in certain contexts, but created vulnerabilities in others. Recognizing and exploiting those vulnerabilities was the key to successful resistance. Unfortunately for most of the Mongols' opponents, recognizing the vulnerabilities and actually being able to exploit them were two different things. Vidin succeeded because the Bulgarians had both the understanding of what was needed and the means to provide it. The long-term impact of Vidin on military thinking is difficult to trace precisely, but we can identify some general trends. The battle reinforced the importance of fortifications in medieval warfare. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, castle building continued and even intensified in many parts of Europe. Engineers developed increasingly sophisticated defensive features, concentric walls, improved towers, better integration with natural terrain features. While much of this development would have happened anyway, battles like Vidin that demonstrated the effectiveness of good fortifications surely influenced military planning. The battle also contributed to European interest in incendiary weapons and other forms of military chemistry. Greek fire itself would gradually be superseded by gunpowder-based weapons, but the basic concept of using chemistry to create military advantages persisted and expanded. By the late medieval period, European armies were experimenting with various forms of grenades, fire arrows, and eventually guns and cannons. This trajectory from Greek fire to gunpowder weapons wasn't direct or simple, but battles like Vidin that showcased the power of advanced weapons technology surely played a role in encouraging such experimentation. For the study of military history, Vidin offers several important lessons that remain relevant. First, preparation and logistics often matter more than battlefield heroics. The unsexy work of stockpiling supplies, training personnel, and maintaining equipment is what enables success when the moment of crisis arrives. Second, technological advantages can be decisive, but only if properly deployed and supported. Greek fire without the fortifications and the river barrier might not have been enough. Third, strategic context matters enormously. The same battle under different political circumstances might have had a completely different outcome. Fourth, leadership at all levels, from the commander making strategic decisions to the specialists operating the Greek fire to the common soldiers holding the walls, all contributed to the final result. The story of Vidin also reminds us of the importance of preserving and studying history, even when sources are fragmentary. Much of what we would like to know about the Battle of Vidin is lost. The names of key participants, precise casualty figures, detailed tactical information, all have been obscured by time and the loss of contemporary sources. Yet enough remains to reconstruct the broad outlines of what happened and to understand its significance. This is the work of historians, piecing together fragmentary evidence to reconstruct the past and extract meaning from it. The modern city of Vidin, largely unaware of its medieval significance, stands as a reminder of how history fades from popular consciousness even as its effects persist. The residents of contemporary Vidin live with the consequences of that winter day in 1260, even if most don't know the story. Bulgaria's very existence as an independent nation, delayed though it was by Ottoman conquest, ultimately derives from moments like Vidin, when resistance succeeded and independence was preserved, if only temporarily. For students of medieval history, Vidin deserves a place alongside better-known battles and events. It may not have the drama of Agincourt or the scale of Manzikert, but its impact on the trajectory of Eastern European history was profound. It represents a pivot point, a moment when the seemingly inevitable was averted, when preparation and innovation overcame what appeared to be overwhelming force. As we conclude this examination of the Battle of Vidin, we return to where we began, the image of that unnamed Bulgarian commander, standing on the walls of his fortress, watching the Mongol army withdraw northward. He had done his job. He had prepared his defenses, trained his men, deployed his weapons effectively, and held his position against the most formidable military force of his age. He couldn't know that historians would still be discussing his victories centuries later. He couldn't know that he had helped halt the western expansion of the Mongol Empire. He probably hoped simply that his city had been saved, his people preserved, and that the terrible threat had passed. In that hope, he was largely correct. The Mongol threat to Bulgaria did pass. The Golden Horde would never again seriously attempt to conquer the region. The defenders of Vidin had changed history through their courage, preparation, and effective use of the tools available to them. It's a lesson that echoes across the centuries, that determined defenders with good preparation and the right tools can prevail even against seemingly overwhelming odds. That technological innovation matters, that leadership matters, that individual actions, multiplied across hundreds or thousands of participants, can shape the destiny of nations. The Battle of Vidin, fought on a cold winter day in 1260 on the banks of the Danube, was one of those moments when history pivoted, when what seemed inevitable was prevented, when the course of European development was preserved rather than diverted. It deserves to be remembered, studied, and understood, not just as a curiosity of medieval military history, but as a significant event that shaped our world. The defenders of Vidin, their names lost but their achievement enduring, earned their place in history through courage, preparation, and the effective use of Greek fire against the Mongol horde. Their victory was Europe's gain.